I believe that an accident took place, and I believe that she was never abducted, and that she likely fell down off the sofa onto the concrete floor, likely cracked her head and died behind the sofa. And that was why the cadaver and blood dogs came in and sniffed. So it's highly likely she died in that apartment.
What if the world's most famous missing child case was never about finding a little girl, but about protecting the people around her? Journalist Sonia Poulton argues that from day one, the Madeleine McCann story was hijacked by powerful PR machines, politicians, and a complicit press. Evidence of death in the apartment ignored. A witness who swore he saw Jerry McCann carrying a child that night, buried. Millions poured into Operation Grange, yet the parents' contradictions remained off limits. Poulton calls it not an investigation, but a cover-up. Her work shatters the polished narrative and asks the forbidden question: was the truth silenced to shield reputations? If so, justice for Madeleine may have been sacrificed before it even began. From the very beginning, the case of Madeleine McCann was unlike any other missing child investigation in modern history. Before Portuguese police could even assemble their timelines, before forensic teams had completed their sweeps of apartment 5A, the story had already been set in motion, not by detectives, but by professional media handlers. Journalist Sonia Poulton, in her documentary Public Relations and Saving Reputations, dissects this disturbing reality: that what the world witnessed was not the unfolding of a transparent investigation, but the launch of a global PR campaign designed to protect reputations and control narratives. At the heart of this operation stood Clarence Mitchell. He was not just a friendly helper or a sympathetic spokesperson. He was a seasoned government spin doctor, a man who once ran the UK government's media monitoring unit under Tony Blair. His job in Whitehall had been to track stories, diffuse scandals, and protect ministers from public backlash. In other words, he was trained to reshape reality for mass consumption. When he left his official government post to become the McCanns' full-time media manager, it was an extraordinary decision. Parents of missing children usually rely on local police, charities, or family friends to amplify their plight. But Jerry and Kate McCann had something no other grieving parents had: a top-tier political PR strategist dedicated solely to their cause. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Within days of Madeleine's disappearance in May 2007, the global press was flooded with a single, unified message. Madeleine was abducted by a stranger. Her parents were innocent victims of a cruel fate. This wasn't the result of careful investigation or corroborated evidence. It was a crafted line, pumped into the media bloodstream by Clarence Mitchell and reinforced by some of Britain's most powerful newspapers. Front pages of The Sun and Daily Mail carried heart-wrenching images of Kate clutching Madeleine's pink toy, Cuddle Cat, her face frozen in anguish. Headlines screamed words like abduction, kidnap, parents' agony. Across television screens, Jerry appeared composed yet broken, addressing the world with the gravitas of a man who had lost everything. The narrative was clear. These were two blameless parents, crushed by tragedy, deserving of sympathy and donations. Poulton highlights the almost eerie uniformity of this coverage. Competing outlets, which normally thrive on different angles, seem to sing from the same hymn sheet. That level of synchronization rarely occurs by accident. Poulton argues that what we were witnessing was not journalism, but branding. The McCann case was packaged like a product launch, complete with messaging strategy, image management, and reputation safeguarding. Clarence Mitchell himself admitted his job was to protect the reputations of Jerry and Kate. The phrasing alone is telling. His priority was not to uncover the truth about Madeleine's fate, but to ensure her parents remained shielded from suspicion. That single mission transformed the trajectory of the case. To understand how powerful this PR framing was, one only has to examine what it buried. When cadaver dogs later alerted to traces of death in apartment 5A and inside the McCanns' rental car, the British media swiftly dismissed it. When inconsistencies in the Tapas 9 witness statements emerged, they were brushed aside as stress-induced errors. Even when Portuguese police officially declared the McCanns orgados, formal suspects, the British press framed it as a cruel witch hunt against grieving parents. The presumption of innocence had been upgraded to a presumption of sainthood, all because the media machine dictated it. For Poulton, the most shocking aspect is how seamlessly the machinery worked. This was not an organic swell of sympathy, it was an engineered crisis management campaign, comparable to corporate strategies when a company faces a scandal. In the business world, PR firms reframe damaging narratives, redirect public anger, and flood outlets with more favorable angles. That is precisely what happened here. A child's disappearance was turned into a case study in media manipulation. Daily Mail editorials framed the McCanns as victims of bureaucratic incompetence in Portugal. The Sun mobilized massive "Find Maddie" campaigns, complete with posters and hotline numbers, focusing attention outward toward shadowy predators rather than inward toward unanswered questions. The consistency of these narratives suggests not spontaneous sympathy, but deliberate coordination. This raises an unsettling question. If the story was shaped from day one, how much of what the public knows about Madeleine's disappearance is grounded in fact? The early hours of any investigation are crucial. They set the foundation for everything that follows. Yet in this case, the foundation was not forensic evidence or police testimony, it was a press release. From that moment on, facts that contradicted the abduction narrative were treated not as leads to be pursued, but as threats to be neutralized. The role of PR in criminal investigations has always been controversial, but in Madeleine's case it reached unprecedented levels. Imagine any other missing child scenario. Would grieving parents hire a government spin doctor before police had even exhausted leads? Would national newspapers suppress skepticism and march in lockstep behind a single storyline? The very strangeness of this dynamic should have raised alarms. Instead, it lulled the public into a carefully choreographed sympathy, one that made questioning the parents feel like blasphemy. Poulton pushes her viewers to confront the wider implications. When the media becomes the mouthpiece for private PR teams, journalism ceases to serve truth and instead serves image. That, Poulton insists, is the true tragedy of the McCann case, not just the loss of a child, but the loss of an honest investigation. The parallels to corporate crisis management cannot be overstated. Executives caught in scandals hire spin doctors to get ahead of the story. Clarence Mitchell did the same for Jerry and Kate, except the stakes here were infinitely higher: a missing child, international police cooperation, and the raw emotions of millions of ordinary people. Yet the mechanics were identical: isolate the client from blame, push an alternative narrative, weaponize sympathetic imagery, and drown out dissent with uniform messaging. This strategy worked. Even now, nearly 2 decades later, many members of the public remain convinced of the abduction narrative, despite evidence gaps and contradictions. Why? Because they were never given a chance to see the case without the PR filter. They were spoon-fed a story from the start, and once that story took hold, it became nearly impossible to dislodge. And so we arrive at Poulton's haunting question: if the truth was obscured on day one, what hope does the world have of ever discovering what really happened to Madeleine McCann? When an investigation is managed like a brand, when journalists are corralled like consumers, and when reputations matter more than facts, can the public ever trust the evidence that emerges? In the end, Sonia Poulton's documentary does more than critique the McCann case. It delivers a warning about the power of PR to override justice itself. What happened in Praia da Luz was not only a tragedy for one family, but a turning point in how crime, media, and reputation intersect. The public believed they were following a mystery. In reality, they were following a script. And once that script was written, the truth was lost somewhere between the headlines. In the long history of criminal investigations, few operations have consumed as much public money, manpower, and media attention as Operation Grange, the British police inquiry into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Launched in 2011 under David Cameron's government, it was presented as a bold and compassionate effort to finally deliver answers in a case that had haunted the nation since 2007. Yet, as journalist Sonia Poulton emphasizes, behind the impressive figures lies a darker truth. Operation Grange was not designed to uncover what happened to Madeleine. Instead, It functioned to protect a pre-established narrative and shield certain individuals from scrutiny. The numbers themselves are staggering. Over £13.2 million of taxpayer money was poured into the investigation, making it one of the most expensive missing persons inquiries in British history. At its height, around 40 officers were assigned to the case, an extraordinary allocation of resources for a single child disappearance, especially one that took place outside British soil. And after 18 years, the outcome remains unchanged. No convictions, no definitive answers, no Madeleine. For Poulton, this is not merely a story of bureaucratic inefficiency, it is a deliberate avoidance of the most uncomfortable possibilities. From the outset, Operation Grange established strict parameters for its inquiry. Scotland Yard announced it would treat the case as one of stranger abduction. That phrase was not an investigative conclusion, it was the starting point. By declaring at the very beginning that Madeleine was taken by an unknown outsider, the police effectively closed the door on any serious examination of alternative scenarios, including those pointing closer to home. This is the crux of Poulton's critique. An investigation should be about following evidence wherever it leads. But in the case of Operation Grange, the evidence trail was pre-filtered to exclude anything that implicated Jerry and Kate McCann. It was, in her words, a process of protecting the narrative, not pursuing the truth. The contrast with the original Portuguese investigation is striking. Gonçalo Amaral, the lead detective in Portugal, initially followed all avenues, including the possibility of parental involvement. His team brought in cadaver dogs, analyzed rental car traces, and questioned inconsistencies in witness statements. When evidence began to hint that Madeleine may not have been abducted at all, Amaral did not shy away. He considered the possibility of an accidental death and a cover-up. For this, he was swiftly removed from the case, subjected to political pressure, and later vilified in the British press. Operation Grange, by contrast, seemed engineered to avoid repeating Amaral's mistake. Scotland Yard never pursued the cadaver dog alerts with vigor, never re-examined the timeline contradictions with seriousness, and never treated the McCanns as legitimate persons of interest. Instead, they focused their energy outward: mysterious burglars, foreign predators, suspicious strangers sighted in Praia da Luz. Year after year, new suspects would appear in the headlines, only to fade away when leads collapsed. Each time the cycle repeated: media frenzy, public donations, followed by silence. Poulton argues that this revolving door of suspects functioned as a distraction, keeping the public gaze fixed away from the central question. Why were the parents never properly investigated by British authorities? The imbalance becomes even more glaring when compared to other missing persons cases. Thousands of children vanish across the UK and Europe every year, yet almost none receive the kind of royal treatment Operation Grange afforded to the McCanns. Most families are left to grieve in obscurity, begging for scraps of police attention, let alone multi-million-pound investigations spanning nearly 2 decades. For many bereaved parents, the disparity is an open wound. Why did Madeleine's disappearance command such vast resources when others were barely acknowledged? The answer, Poulton suggests, lies not in compassion but in connections. Jerry and Kate McCann were not ordinary parents. They were educated, professional, middle-class doctors with powerful friends in politics, media, and law. Gordon Brown, then Chancellor of the Exchequer and later Prime Minister, personally expressed sympathy. Tony Blair's inner circle extended them support. Clarence Mitchell, as noted earlier, was a former government press officer. These connections transformed the McCann case from a tragedy into a political issue, and once politics enters the scene, the machinery of protection grinds into motion. In this context, Operation Grange appears less like an investigation and more like a performance, a costly spectacle to show the public that something is being done, while carefully avoiding the avenues that might damage reputations at the highest levels. Poulton is unsparing in her assessment. Operation Grange was not about finding Madeleine. It was about maintaining the abduction narrative and ensuring the parents were never under serious threat. Indeed, even the structure of Operation Grange reveals its bias. The Metropolitan Police repeatedly insisted their inquiry was merely a review of the Portuguese files, later upgraded to an investigation. Yet in practice, they cherry-picked the lines of inquiry that fit the abduction framework while dismissing the rest. When cadaver dogs signaled possible death in the apartment and car, British officers downplayed the findings as unreliable. When Portuguese detectives highlighted contradictions in the McCanns' testimonies, Scotland Yard ignored them. When Amaral published his book The Truth of the Lie, presenting evidence-based suspicions, the McCanns sued him in an attempt to silence his voice, backed by a media campaign that vilified him as a rogue. All the while, the British public was told to keep faith in Operation Grange, to trust that the best detectives were working tirelessly for justice. Yet justice, in this case, became indistinguishable from reputation management. The waste is not only financial but moral. Each year, the spectacle of Operation Grange eroded public trust in the institutions meant to safeguard truth. Taxpayers watched millions vanish into a black hole of bureaucracy, while grieving families of other missing children wondered why their cases were deemed less worthy. Meanwhile, the unanswered questions about Madeleine lingered, unresolved not because answers were unattainable, but because certain answers were unpalatable. By 2025, Operation Grange stands as a cautionary tale about how political influence can distort justice. It was framed as an act of compassion, but its legacy is one of avoidance. Poulton's indictment is clear: the investigation was hijacked to protect reputations, not a little girl. The child became secondary to the narrative, the truth, secondary to appearances. And so we are left with the most haunting question of all. Why did the British government lavish such extraordinary attention, resources, and protection on one family, while actively steering its police force away from the most logical lines of inquiry? Was it political embarrassment, institutional corruption, or something deeper that has yet to be revealed? Until that question is answered, Operation Grange will remain not a beacon of justice, but a monument to how truth can be buried under money, power, and spin. In every great scandal there comes a moment when the system, cornered by doubt and public fatigue, produces a figure to absorb suspicion. For the Madeleine McCann case, that figure is Christian Brückner. On paper, he appears the perfect villain, a convicted offender, a drifter with a sordid past, a man whose very face conjures images of danger. But in Sonia Poulton's analysis, Brückner is not the solution to the mystery. He is the distraction, a convenient scapegoat wheeled out to keep the public's fury alive, while ensuring the spotlight never turns back to the McCanns. Brückner's biography reads like a dossier designed to repulse. Born in Germany, he spent much of his adult life drifting through Europe, sustaining himself on petty crimes, banned substance trafficking, and offenses. He had been convicted several times, in the very town where Madeleine disappeared. He lived in a camper van near the resort, trafficked banned substance across borders, and was known for his violent temper. In other words, he fit the archetype of the monster lurking in the shadows. It is precisely this image, Poulton argues, that made him such a useful suspect. To the public, the logic is disarmingly simple: Madeleine vanished, Brückner was in the area, and he is a sexual predator. For a press desperate for closure and a government eager to reaffirm the abduction narrative, he became the perfect candidate. As one British tabloid triumphantly declared in 2020, finally, the suspect we've been waiting for. Yet when we strip away the convenient narrative, the evidentiary foundation crumbles. Despite years of investigation, there is no direct forensic evidence linking Brückner to Madeleine. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitness placing him with the child. His connection rests largely on circumstantial fragments. The fact that his phone pinged in the Praia da Luz area on the night of May 3, 2007. The fact that he once boasted he knew what happened to Madeleine. The fact that his criminal past made him plausible. But plausibility is not proof. In 2024, the weakness of the case became undeniable when Brückner was acquitted of several charges that German prosecutors had pinned on him. Although he remains imprisoned for unrelated crimes, the supposed Madeleine connection has not withstood the rigors of court. German prosecutors continue to insist they have evidence he is the killer. But after years of grandstanding, no trial for Madeleine has begun. Instead, leaks, hints, and media speculation substitute for hard fact. The result is a suspect who lingers in limbo, guilty in the court of public opinion, unconvicted in the court of law. This, Poulton contends, is no accident. Brückner functions as a smokescreen. By keeping him in the headlines, the media sustains the illusion that progress is being made, that the case is active, that answers are imminent. Each new, exclusive, about his camper van, his prison confessions, his ex-girlfriend's testimonies feeds the cycle. Meanwhile, the more uncomfortable line of inquiry, the contradictions in the McCanns' statements, the cadaver dog alerts, the original suspicions of the Portuguese police, fades further into obscurity. The strategy is as cynical as it is effective. Poulton describes Brückner as the ideal suspect because he is so repugnant that the public won't question it. In other words, his very depravity anesthetizes critical thinking. Who would rush to defend a convicted man who did wrong to an elderly woman? Who would pause to ask whether evidence against him is sufficient? The disgust he provokes becomes the glue that holds the narrative together. British and German media alike have exploited this dynamic with gusto. In June 2020, when German prosecutors first named Brückner as their prime suspect, headlines erupted across Europe. German man linked to Madeleine's disappearance. Police closing in on Maddie suspect. Breakthrough in the McCann case. Television documentaries followed, framing him as the long-awaited answer. Some outlets even referred to him casually as the killer. Despite the absence of a conviction, the presumption of guilt was not just implied, it was declared. But as months turned into years, the supposed breakthrough never materialized. There was no trial, no conviction, no closure. Instead, the story kept looping. New searches of reservoirs, new interviews with acquaintances, new promises of imminent charges. Each time, the McCanns were shielded from fresh suspicion. Each time, the abduction narrative was reinforced. And each time, the public was asked to direct its outrage toward a man who, while undeniably guilty of many things, has not been proven guilty of this. The comparison to other notorious scapegoats in criminal history is instructive. When public pressure demands a resolution, but true answers are either unavailable or politically inconvenient, systems often produce a sacrificial figure. They embody the fear, absorb the anger, and allow institutions to declare progress. Brückner's role, Poulton suggests, fits this mold precisely. He is not presented to deliver justice. He is presented to sustain belief in a failing narrative. Even some legal experts have grown uneasy with the way the case has unfolded. German prosecutors, led by Hans Christian Wolters, have at times issued bold public statements claiming they know Brückner killed Madeleine. Yet when pressed to reveal evidence, they retreat into secrecy, citing ongoing investigations. This cycle of dramatic announcement and evasive silence fuels headlines but erodes legal credibility. By 2025, the dissonance is glaring. If the evidence is strong, why no trial? If it is weak, why the years of public assertion? The danger of this scapegoating strategy is twofold. First, it risks convicting a man in the court of public opinion without giving him the chance to defend himself properly. Justice, after all, is supposed to be about evidence, not reputation. Second, it risks burying the real truth about Madeleine. If Brückner is not guilty, and the absence of solid proof suggests he may not be, then every year spent chasing him is another year lost to history. Another year in which the true circumstances of her disappearance grow colder, fainter, less recoverable. Poulton's documentary warns of this precise danger. They bought themselves time. But time is the enemy of truth. The longer the world is encouraged to wait for answers from Germany, the less urgency remains to revisit the troubling questions at the heart of the case. Questions like, why were the McCanns never properly investigated by British police? Why were cadaver dog alerts dismissed? Why was Goncalo Amaral silenced? Why was Operation Grange so carefully constrained? By 2025, Christian Brückner remains behind bars, not for Madeleine, but for other crimes. His name, however, is permanently etched into the story as the prime suspect. Whether he is guilty or not has become almost irrelevant. What matters is that his existence provides cover, a shield for institutions and individuals who cannot afford the truth to emerge. And so the Madeleine McCann case continues to drift in a haze of suspicion and performance. The parents are protected. The police maintain their narrative. The media has its villain. The public, wary and bewildered, is asked to keep waiting for justice that never comes. But Poulton's conclusion is unflinching. A convenient suspect is not the same as a proven culprit. Until the world confronts that difference, Madeleine's story will remain unsolved. Not because it cannot be solved, but because it has been deliberately misdirected. In most disappearance cases, investigators cling to every scrap of forensic data, every witness statement, every inconsistency that might reveal the truth. Yet in the story of Madeleine McCann, the very evidence that should have been pivotal was treated as an inconvenience, filed away, or outright dismissed. Sonia Poulton has repeatedly emphasized that what we are dealing with is not the absence of evidence, but the deliberate refusal to allow that evidence to matter. Perhaps the most unsettling example comes from the car the McCanns rented nearly 3 months after Madeleine vanished. Forensic specialists examined the Renault Scenic and discovered that samples taken from the boot contained 15 out of 19 DNA markers, consistent with Madeleine's profile. In the world of forensic science, such a match is not trivial, not a coincidence, not something that can simply be waved away. If this had been any other family, unknown, ordinary, lacking political connections, this would have triggered immediate suspicion. It would have been enough to justify charges, or at the very least an intensive line of inquiry into what exactly had happened to that little girl. Instead, the finding was diluted by explanations that bordered on the absurd. British authorities suggested that the DNA might have been transferred through everyday items, that it could have been the result of secondary contamination, or that statistical probability did not reach the mythical standard of 100% certainty. The question Poulton asks, and it is a damning one, is why this evidence was treated with such hesitance, as though the investigators were not trying to solve a mystery, but to protect a narrative. Supporting the forensic trail were the alerts of 2 highly trained sniffer dogs, Eddie and Keela, brought in by the Portuguese police. Eddie, the cadaver dog, alerted strongly to the scent of human remains in apartment 5A, the very flat from which Madeleine disappeared. He also alerted to the Renault Scenic, specifically the boot where the DNA markers had been found. Keela, trained to detect human blood, confirmed the presence of blood traces in the apartment. In other cases around the world, the testimony of such dogs has been considered compelling, often strong enough to push an investigation forward or secure a conviction. But here, their alerts were sidelined, mocked by critics, or buried under legal semantics. It was as if the system could not allow these dogs to speak too loudly, because what they were saying contradicted the carefully crafted image of an abduction. Beyond the forensic trail, the human behavior surrounding the case raises equally troubling questions. Kate McCann, for reasons she never convincingly explained, refused to answer 48 questions posed by Portuguese investigators. These were not abstract or invasive queries. They were the essential questions any parent would be asked in such a situation. Where exactly were you at the time? What did you do immediately afterward? Why did you make certain choices? Her silence has always loomed over the case, a silence that would have condemned a less protected parent in the eyes of law enforcement. Jerry McCann, meanwhile, struggled with inconsistencies in his timeline of events. Statements shifted, details contradicted each other, and yet none of this was treated with the gravity it deserved. In courtrooms across the world, contradictions like these are used to dismantle credibility. In the McCann case, they were treated as footnotes, as though the narrative had already been written and the truth had to be edited to fit. Then there is the matter of Cuddle Cat, the beloved soft toy that Madeleine never slept without. On the night she disappeared, it was discovered in her bed, and in the days that followed, Kate was often photographed clutching it tightly, a symbol of maternal grief. But what most people do not know is that shortly after the disappearance, the toy was washed. To anyone familiar with crime scene preservation, this is a stunning breach of logic. If your child had vanished under suspicious circumstances, would you not guard every object that might carry their scent, their DNA, or even the trace of a stranger? Instead, the Cuddle Cat was scrubbed clean, erasing any potential forensic evidence it might have held. The public was left with the image of a grieving mother clutching the toy, unaware that its evidential value had been destroyed. Poulton points to this as one of the most symbolic acts in the entire case, the conversion of potential evidence into a prop of public relations. Taken together, the DNA evidence, the cadaver dog alerts, the unanswered police questions, the contradictory statements, and the suspicious handling of objects form a pattern that should have reshaped the investigation. In the case of an ordinary family, every one of these elements would have been seized upon by prosecutors. DNA in a car, a child's toy washed clean, parents refusing to answer questions, cadaver dogs indicating death inside the family apartment. These are not minor curiosities. They are red flags so bright that they would normally blind investigators until they could no longer look away. But in this case, they were ignored, buried under layers of excuses and, more importantly, drowned out by a media machine determined to present the McCanns as victims of a shadowy abductor rather than potential suspects. The result is a haunting paradox. The evidence is there, but it has been silenced. The contradictions are clear, but they have been rationalized. The questions remain, but they have been left unanswered for nearly 2 decades. If the public is told not to trust the DNA, not to trust the dogs, not to question the parents, then what exactly are we supposed to trust? If all that remains is the narrative of abduction, polished by public relations and broadcast across front pages, then the entire case becomes not an investigation, but a performance. And perhaps the most chilling question of all is this: if the strongest pieces of evidence in one of the most famous missing children's cases in the world can be ignored, what hope is there for truth in the countless other cases that never make the headlines? Among the mountain of theories, contradictions, and unanswered questions in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, there is one moment, one testimony, that stands apart as both chilling and transformative. It is known as the Smith sighting. To this day, many journalists, including Sonia Poulton, describe it as the single most dangerous piece of evidence for the McCanns, precisely because of what it implied and the speed with which it was swept under the rug. On the night of May 3, 2007, at approximately 10 p.m., an Irish family, the Smiths, were walking back to their apartment in Praia da Luz after a night out. As they strolled down the quiet street, they noticed a man carrying a little girl. She appeared to be about 4 years old, barefoot, wearing pale-colored pajamas, her arms hanging limply in the way of a child who is deeply asleep. The Smiths thought little of it at first, until the news broke later that night. A British child named Madeleine McCann had gone missing from her holiday apartment, just a few hundred meters away. The memory of that man became seared into their minds. What made the sighting particularly explosive was not simply that the description of the girl matched Madeleine, but that the man carrying her bore a striking resemblance to Jerry McCann himself. The Smith family emphasized the familiarity of the way he held the child, not like a stranger, awkward and uncertain, but like a father carrying his daughter. One of the Smith sons later remarked that when he saw footage of Jerry carrying one of his other children off a plane, he froze. The gait, the posture, the tilt of the arms, it was exactly what he had witnessed in Praia da Luz. If true, this detail detonates the entire abduction narrative, because it suggests that the figure spotted was not a shadowy intruder slipping through the night, but the child's own father. And if that is the case, then Madeleine's disappearance ceases to be the story of a foreign predator and becomes something far darker, a tragedy concealed within the family itself. Yet despite the gravity of the Smith testimony, the sighting was quickly marginalized in the official investigations. Scotland Yard's Operation Grange referred to it only in passing, preferring instead to focus on a much weaker sighting reported by Jane Tanner earlier that evening. Tanner described a man carrying a child in pajamas near the McCann apartment around 9:15 p.m. But this, Tanner sighting, was later debunked when another holidaymaker admitted he was likely the man she saw, carrying his own child back to bed. Still, Operation Grange clung to the Tanner account for years, framing it as central, while the Smith sighting, occurring 45 minutes later and fitting the timeline far more tightly, was almost erased from the narrative. Why? Poulton suggests that the answer is uncomfortable but unavoidable, because the Smith sighting pointed in the wrong direction. It did not lead toward an anonymous foreign suspect, nor toward the German drifter later named as Christian Brückner. It led directly back to the McCanns. And from the beginning, the machinery of public relations, supported by the British establishment, had been designed to shield the family from suspicion. The suppression of this lead is particularly glaring when compared to how other missing child cases are treated. Ordinarily, eyewitness testimony from multiple family members, describing a man who looked like the child's father, carrying a girl matching the victim's description, would have become the beating heart of the investigation. Police would have cross-examined every word, reconstructed the route, checked cameras, and interrogated the parents with renewed urgency. Yet here, nothing of the sort happened. The McCanns were never pressed publicly about this testimony, and the sighting slipped into obscurity, kept alive only by independent investigators, journalists like Poulton, and a small circle of online researchers who refused to forget it. The implications are staggering. If the Smith family was correct, then the entire trajectory of the case could have changed in May 2007. Madeleine's disappearance might not be a cold case today, but a solved one. Instead, this golden lead was buried beneath years of distraction, expensive but fruitless investigations, and the convenient appearance of alternative suspects. Poulton calls the Smith sighting the golden clue that was buried. It was, in her analysis, too dangerous to the carefully managed narrative of an abduction. Because unlike the DNA or the dogs, both of which could be debated in court with technical arguments, this was a direct human testimony from multiple people, consistent and unwavering, and it implicated someone who was supposed to be beyond suspicion. Even today, supporters of the McCanns dismiss the sighting as unreliable. They argue that eyewitness memory is flawed, that the Smiths could have been mistaken, that their identification was not absolute. And yes, eyewitness testimony is fallible, but that does not justify erasing it entirely. In fact, in a fair investigation, such testimony should have been tested against every other available piece of evidence. Was Jerry's alibi watertight? Did the timeline of his movements that night leave room for him to be the man the Smiths saw? Were there corroborating details in phone records, CCTV, or the accounts of others at the tapas restaurant? These are the questions that should have been asked, yet they were not. Instead, Scotland Yard brushed the sighting aside, and the media followed suit. Headlines trumpeted other suspects, other leads, other distractions, while the possibility that the answer had been glimpsed on a quiet Portuguese street that very night was quietly shelved. For Poulton, this is perhaps the most damning indictment of the entire affair, that the truth might have been seen with human eyes and spoken with human voices, but was deemed too dangerous to pursue. And so the question lingers, heavy and unresolved. Why was this sighting ignored? Why would the testimony of a respectable Irish family, given consistently and sincerely, be sidelined in favor of weaker, less reliable accounts? The only plausible explanation is that it pointed where no one in power was willing to look. And that brings us back to the uncomfortable reality Poulton insists upon. If the most dangerous clue in the case could be silenced, then what does that say about the investigation as a whole? Was it ever truly about finding Madeleine, or was it always about preserving reputations? If the answer lies in the arms of a man seen walking down a Portuguese street at 10 p.m. on May 3, 2007, then perhaps the mystery was never unsolvable. Perhaps it was simply never allowed to be solved. From the very first night of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the machinery of the British press did not act as a neutral watchdog or an independent seeker of truth. For Sonia Poulton, who has dissected both the media coverage and the institutional power behind it, this was not a case of bad reporting or poor judgment. It was a case of active collusion, a system in which newspapers, broadcasters, and PR experts worked hand in hand to protect the McCanns, to protect reputations, and above all, to protect a story. The story was simple, compelling, and emotionally irresistible. A beautiful little girl stolen from her bed by an unknown predator. while her helpless parents became the embodiment of suffering innocence. It was the kind of narrative that newspapers like the Daily Mail and tabloids like The Sun thrive upon, filled with both tragedy and voyeurism. But what made it extraordinary was not just how widely this version was told, it was how singularly dominant it became. Almost overnight, the possibility of alternative explanations was erased from mainstream conversation. A famous TV station in America, which prided itself on impartiality, repeated the abduction storyline as fact. Another famous channel goes further. In 2009, just 2 years after the disappearance, the network released a documentary that purported to reconstruct events. Rather than a sober investigation, it became what Poulton memorably called a crockumentary. A crocodile of deception dressed as factual reporting. Every frame leaned toward absolving the McCanns, dramatizing the idea of an intruder slipping silently into apartment 5A and painting Kate and Jerry as the tragic victims of fate. This pattern repeated across nearly every major outlet. The sympathetic photo spreads of Kate clutching Madeleine's pink cuddle cat. The carefully staged interviews with Jerry, calm but insistent that there was absolutely no evidence. Madeleine was dead. The dramatic reenactments of an abductor climbing through windows or carrying the child away. These were not acts of journalism. They were acts of narrative construction. And once the narrative was built, it became almost impossible to challenge. Journalists who tried to push back discovered this very quickly. Goncalo Amaral, the Portuguese detective who had dared to follow the evidence toward the possibility of parental involvement, was vilified in the British press. His book, The Truth of the Lie, which laid out the DNA findings and the inconsistencies of the McCanns' accounts, was attacked as slander, and he himself was dragged through legal battles designed to silence him. Sonia Poulton, too, when she began to raise questions, found herself targeted by campaigns of smearing and dismissal. Rather than addressing the substance of their concerns, the media went after their credibility, branding them conspiracy theorists or bitter obsessives. The contrast is striking. When the parents of working-class or marginalized children lose a son or daughter, they are often subjected to brutal media scrutiny. Their lifestyles, their choices, their histories are raked over, dissected, and judged. But here, in the case of two middle-class doctors, well-connected and articulate, the press instead closed ranks around them. The protection was extraordinary, almost reverential. Poulton has asked the question that lingers like a blade. If the McCanns had been poor, uneducated, or foreign, would the same media machine have extended such courtesy? Or would they have been crucified on the front pages, condemned as neglectful parents at best and suspects at worst? It is this selective sympathy that reveals the true face of the coverage. It was never about truth. It was about optics. It was about ensuring that the narrative remained intact. By presenting the McCanns as victims beyond reproach, the media created a barrier of public opinion so strong that even police investigations struggled to push against it. And in doing so, they transformed journalism into something more insidious, public relations disguised as reporting. Every time an inconvenient fact emerged, like the reports of the cadaver dogs signaling in the apartment and the rental car, it was briefly mentioned, then quickly drowned in a flood of sympathetic coverage. Headlines would shift focus back to alleged foreign predators, to blurry CCTV footage of unknown men, to possible sightings in Morocco or Malta. The reader was invited to look anywhere but toward the parents themselves. To doubt the McCanns was to place oneself outside the bounds of polite conversation. This collusion was not accidental. Clarence Mitchell, the former government spokesperson who became the McCanns' PR chief, played a central role. His background in managing information for the state prepared him perfectly for shaping the story for the media. With him at the helm, every press conference, every photo opportunity, every carefully worded statement was orchestrated to maintain the abduction narrative. The media did not resist this manipulation, they embraced it. The result was a case study not in free journalism, but in crisis management, polished for the consumption of millions. Looking back now, the effect is chilling. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann was not only a personal tragedy, it became a media product, refined and marketed with ruthless efficiency. The audience, desperate for answers, was given a story to believe in, even if that story omitted critical truths. And the question Poulton forces us to confront is this: if the press can collude so openly, so effectively, in something as grave as the disappearance of a child, then what other truths have been buried beneath the comforting fabric of a narrative? 18 years on, the result of this collusion is plain. The case remains unsolved, the parents remain untouchable, and the public remains divided between those who see a mystery and those who see a cover-up. And perhaps that is the most shocking revelation of all. That journalism, the supposed guardian of accountability, chose in this case not to illuminate, but to obscure, not to question, but to protect, not to reveal, but to conceal. For those still searching for Madeleine, this betrayal is as bitter as the silence of the night she disappeared. For the rest of us, it is a reminder that the media is not always a mirror to reality. It is sometimes a mask. From the moment Madeleine McCann's face appeared on front pages and television screens across the world, the case stopped belonging to investigators and started belonging to millions of strangers. Everyone had an opinion, and those opinions quickly hardened into two irreconcilable camps: those who saw the McCanns as devastated parents fighting against unimaginable odds, and those who saw them as unreliable, evasive, and perhaps even responsible for their daughter's disappearance. This division was not subtle, it was visceral. In one camp were those who repeated the official story as if it were gospel. An intruder entered apartment 5EA, carried Madeleine away, and left two innocent parents to endure a lifetime of grief. For them, Kate and Jerry were symbols of tragedy, worthy of sympathy and protection. To question them was to wound them further, to inflict cruelty on a family already destroyed by loss. This side often echoed the words printed by the mainstream press, trusting that the authorities and the journalists could not possibly have colluded in anything less than the truth. But in the other camp, suspicion grew quickly. For those who read beyond the headlines, or who stumbled across details buried deep in police files, the inconsistencies were too glaring to ignore. Why did the cadaver dogs react in the McCann's apartment and car? Why did Kate refuse to answer 48 police questions? Why was Cuddle Cat, the toy she clung to for comfort, washed so soon after the disappearance? And above all, why did the press machine move with such ruthless efficiency to shield the parents from scrutiny? For this camp, Madeleine's disappearance looked less like an abduction and more like a story crafted to cover an uncomfortable truth. Social media became the stage on which this war of perception played out. On X, threads dissected timelines and contradictions. On Facebook, groups formed, some dedicated to supporting the McCanns, others to exposing what they believed was a cover-up. YouTube became perhaps the fiercest battleground, with independent creators, documentarians, and commentators producing hours of content questioning the official narrative. Each video would spawn thousands of comments, some defending the McCanns with passionate loyalty, others condemning them with equal ferocity. The language of this divide grew ugly. Those who questioned the McCanns were branded anti-McCann, a term used as both insult and warning. Many faced harassment threats, and even legal action. The McCanns' legal team pursued critics with defamation suits, ensuring that doubt carried not only social but also financial risk. Journalists like Goncalo Amaral and Sonia Poulton were vilified. Ordinary members of the public who dared post skepticism online sometimes found themselves targeted by waves of abuse. What should have been a search for truth became a war of reputations, with Madeleine herself, the little girl at the center, reduced to a pawn in the fight. Sonia Poulton described this phenomenon bluntly: even the public has been manipulated by PR. The battle lines were not natural, they were manufactured. The effect was powerful. Many who might have voiced doubts simply stayed silent, unwilling to risk being ostracized or worse. But beneath the noise, something darker happened. Madeleine herself disappeared a second time, not from her bed in Portugal, but from the conversation that followed. In the endless debates about her parents' guilt or innocence, in the fury of legal battles and media spin, the child, who should have been at the center, became a background figure. The public fought about the McCanns, about the police, about the press, but rarely about Madeleine. Who she was, what she loved, what was stolen from her. 18 years later, this is the bitter legacy of that division. A girl who vanished into the night has been buried beneath arguments about reputation and narrative. The internet remembers her less as a child and more as a controversy. And perhaps that is the most devastating manipulation of all. That public opinion, the one force that could have demanded true accountability, was turned inward against itself. The energy that should have gone toward finding Madeleine or demanding justice was spent instead on fighting one another. Lost beneath the noise of press conferences, court battles, and endless speculation lies the most painful truth of all. The story of Madeleine McCann has become less about Madeleine and more about everyone else. Nearly 2 decades after she disappeared, the little girl herself has been overshadowed. Her life, her personality, her innocence buried beneath layers of PR spin, police posturing, and public division. Journalist Sonia Poulton has put it bluntly, the only person in this case who never had a voice is Madeleine. It is an extraordinary observation. When one revisits the coverage that has dominated newspapers and television since 2007, the central figure is rarely Madeleine. Instead, it is Jerry and Kate McCann, her parents, whose grief has been staged, photographed, and broadcast across the globe. Or it is Clarence Mitchell, their spokesman, shaping the narrative. Or Christian Brückner, the convenient suspect paraded for headlines. Or Goncalo Amaral, the detective vilified for questioning the official story. Each of these figures has been debated, dissected, defended, or demonized. But Madeleine herself, the small child who should have been the heart of the matter, has too often been reduced to a logo. Her image became an emblem, a brand. The wide eyes staring from posters. The photograph with the distinctive coloboma in her right eye, used as a marketing tool to raise funds and rally awareness. These images traveled the world, plastered on billboards, flashed on television, printed in newspapers. But they did not convey Madeleine the child. They conveyed Madeleine the campaign. To millions of people, she ceased to be a girl with quirks, joys, and fears. She became a symbol of loss, a pawn in a media war. This is not how missing children are usually remembered. In other cases, the public learns about who the child was, what they loved, how they laughed, the details that humanize them. Their stories are told with tenderness, even when the outcome is tragic. But with Madeleine, the narrative quickly shifted. The child became background. The spotlight fell on the parents' pain, the authorities' incompetence, the journalists' agendas. What should have been a portrait of a life interrupted became a drama about reputation and power. The irony is almost unbearable. The stated purpose of the global campaign was to find Madeleine. Yet the very campaign that carried her name so loudly also erased her. In the storm of debates about abduction versus accident, about DNA versus dogs, about Portuguese versus British policing, her voice, imaginary though it must be, was drowned out. She was no longer the subject, but the object of the story. She existed only through the words of others, words that often served agendas far removed from truth or justice. Poulton's critique stings because it is undeniable. The PR machine succeeded in protecting the McCanns' reputations, in focusing attention on endless alternative suspects, in shaping public sympathy. But in the process, Madeleine herself was silenced twice, once by her disappearance, and again by the way her disappearance was exploited. Her name became a brand. Her photograph became a trademark. Her identity became currency in a marketplace of media spin. And so the question emerges, who in the end has justice been sought for? Was it for Madeleine, the child who never returned from her holiday in Portugal? Or was it for her parents, whose image required constant repair and defense? When millions of pounds are spent on Operation Grange, when documentaries air on primetime television, when newspapers run sympathetic portraits of the McCanns, while glossing over inconvenient facts, one wonders, where in all of this is Madeleine? The most tragic dimension of this erasure is that Madeleine was real. She was a daughter, a sister, a little girl who should have grown up with memories of beaches, schools, birthdays, and ordinary childhood moments. Instead, she has been flattened into an icon, a face on a poster. She has become more symbol than person, more case than child. Poulton argues that this is perhaps the cruelest manipulation of all. that in the desperate effort to manage the narrative, the humanity of the victim has been sacrificed. Other missing children are remembered in intimate ways. Their families share anecdotes, friends recall their laughter, their teachers describe their promise. But Madeleine is remembered primarily as a campaign slogan, her existence mediated by PR. When people say her name, they often speak not of her, but of the controversy. The McCann case, the abduction story, the investigation. Her identity has been swallowed by the spectacle. Nearly 2 decades later, the absence of Madeleine's own story raises a brutal question. Has justice in this case ever truly been for her? Or has it been for the adults who orbit around her memory, preserving their images, defending their choices, securing their reputations? If the child herself has been lost in the noise, then justice has already failed, not simply because she remains missing, but because her humanity has been overshadowed. Madeleine McCann was more than a headline, more than a face in a poster. She was a little girl who deserved to be seen, not as a symbol of a PR campaign, but as a person. Until the narrative returns to her, until the world remembers that at the heart of this saga lies a silenced child, the search for truth will remain incomplete. Because in the end, if Madeleine herself has been forgotten, then the entire story is nothing more than a performance staged for everyone but her. 18 years have passed since a small girl vanished from a holiday apartment in Portugal, and in that time nearly everything imaginable has been written, debated, or speculated about the case of Madeleine McCann. Governments have poured millions of pounds into investigations. The press has churned out thousands of articles and documentaries. Suspects have been named, shamed, and dismissed. Parents have been shielded, vilified, and canonized. Journalists have been sued, silenced, or blacklisted. Yet through it all, one thing remains constant: the truth is still absent. The sheer scale of the resources expended makes the emptiness more galling. By 2025, Operation Grange had cost British taxpayers more than £13 million. At its peak, 40 officers worked the case. International cooperation spanned Portugal, the UK, and Germany. Hundreds of leads were chased, hundreds of hours of footage reviewed, hundreds of witnesses questioned. And yet, not a single conviction, not a single definitive answer, not a single resolution to the question that matters most: what happened to Madeleine? If this had been an ordinary missing child, one without political connections, without a PR team, without global media saturation, the investigation would likely have ended within months, resources exhausted and files closed. Instead, the world has been strung along for nearly 2 decades, told to keep faith, told that answers are just around the corner, while nothing emerges but shadows. At the center of this emptiness sits the Smith sighting, the testimony that could have changed everything in 2007. The Irish family who saw a man carrying a small girl that night offered perhaps the most credible account in the entire case. Their description, eerily reminiscent of Jerry McCann himself, has haunted the investigation like a ghost. If their memory is accurate, then the entire narrative of abduction collapses, and with it the edifice of protection built around the parents. If their memory is mistaken, then we are left with an even darker prospect: that an unknown man carried a child away into the night and has never been identified, let alone brought to justice. In either case, the failure to pursue this lead with vigor speaks volumes. It is not merely a missed opportunity, it is a willful burial of what Sonia Poulton calls the golden clue. And this is the pattern that runs through the whole story. Every piece of evidence that pointed inward, DNA traces in the car, cadaver dog alerts in the apartment, contradictions in the parents' statements, was either dismissed or excused. Every avenue that pointed outward, foreign predators, petty burglars, German drifters, was pursued endlessly, even when the trail was weak, even when it led nowhere. What emerges is not a portrait of justice, but of selective blindness. An investigation designed not to uncover but to protect, not to illuminate but to obscure. Poulton's conclusion is both damning and sobering. Only an independent investigation, free from political interference and media spin, can ever resolve this. For her, the problem is not merely the McCanns or the police or the press. It is the entire ecosystem that allowed a tragedy to be transformed into a performance. when political figures intervene to ensure narratives are protected, when PR experts dictate the terms of sympathy, when the press abandons skepticism in favor of copy-paste headlines, then truth becomes the first casualty. What remains is not an investigation but a theater, where the actors play their parts convincingly while the audience forgets that the script was written long ago. The lesson, bitter as it is, reaches beyond Madeleine. It is about justice for children everywhere. Poulton warns that when PR can silence DNA, when political pressure can erase cadaver dogs, when the image of grieving parents becomes more sacred than the possibility of their accountability, then no child is safe. Because justice, in such a system, is not about the vulnerable, it is about the powerful. And if reputations can outweigh truth, then the very notion of justice for children is hollow. What has been forgotten in all the noise is the child herself. Madeleine Beth McCann was not a campaign, not a logo, not a media slogan. She was a little girl who should have grown up, who should have played, laughed, and loved. Instead, her face became a brand, her name a headline, her identity consumed by controversy. Poulton's most painful observation remains: the only person in this case who never had a voice is Madeleine. And that silence is perhaps the most unforgivable crime of all. So where does the truth lie? Perhaps it lies in a Portuguese street in 2007, when an Irish family saw a man carrying a sleeping girl. Perhaps it lies in a car boot, in traces of DNA that should never have been there. Perhaps it lies in the memory of a toy, scrubbed clean when it should have been preserved. Or perhaps it lies in the cold reality that no one truly wanted to find it, that the search for Madeleine was, from the beginning, less about her and more about those who stood to lose everything if the truth came out. The story ends, for now, not with closure but with a question that has lingered for 18 years and will haunt us for as many more. Was the truth about Madeleine's silence to protect reputations? And if so, what does that say about us? Not just about the McCanns or the police or the press, but about a society that allowed it to happen. In the end, all that remains is the line that should never be forgotten: a child cannot simply vanish into silence. And if silence has prevailed, then it is because someone chose to bury the truth. As Poulton puts it with devastating clarity, a child cannot disappear into nothingness. The truth was always there, held, hidden, and shielded by those who should have faced it.